So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Oliver. He's our panel lead for this panel. He's a Master's of Landscape Architecture as well as Urban Spatial Analytics here at Penn. And take it away.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for being here. This panel will examine the relationship between cities and nature. If we frame this relationship in the terms of this year's conference, Embedded Environments, Making the Invisible Visible, we can think of urban environments as embedded within the often invisible natural systems. The goal of this panel is to illuminate nature's power to shape a better urban future, as well as the challenges and benefits of doing so. The name of this panel comes from the idea that nature can be thought of as a network of technologies billions of years in the making. Operating at all scales, from the global to the microscopic, nature's interconnectedness means that weaving natural systems into the urban fabric provides an opportunity to address multiple challenges at once. Nature's interconnectedness cuts both ways. The task of incorporating its technologies into our cities is often complex and fraught. But incorporating natural systems into urban systems has the potential to increase the flexibility and resilience of cities in an increasingly unpredictable climate. To that end, we've invited three people whose practices navigate the nexus of nature and cities. Each of them brings to this conversation a different angle of thinking: the regional, the urban, and the scale of the site. At the regional scale, Andrew Rudd, Urban Environment Officer for UN Habitat's Program Development Branch in New York, is leading the development of the Program Development Branch in New York is leading the agency's urban biodiversity program and has managed projects related to urban form and public space in more than 20 countries. At the urban scale, Erica Smith-Fichman, acting manager of the Urban Forestry Unit for Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, works with residents to bring the benefits of trees to the communities that need them the most in the ways that support them the best. At the scale of the site, Gena Wirth, landscape architect and design principal at SCAPE Landscape Architecture, leads the design and implementation of complex multi-stakeholder landscapes, including public and private waterfronts, regional trail systems, parks, plazas, and climate adaptation plans. And finally, our moderator for this panel, invited for her familiarity with the multitude of scales and angles of approaching the nature-urban nexus, is Catherine Sievett, Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design and co-executive director of the McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology. Now, we'll kick off this panel with a brief presentation from each of our panelists, starting with Andrew Rudd. The floor is yours, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Oliver, and thanks to both Wharton and Weitzman. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. So, I'm going to start with a downer. The world's facing a very likely sixth extinction event with total ecological collapse, arguably more devastating even than climate change itself. It's not really a mystery why a lot of species are going extinct, largely through habitat loss, and a lot of habitat loss is coming about through telecoupled impacts, right? So land cleared for agriculture in one part of the world that's satisfying demands of consumers in a very different part of the world. That's tough to deal with. But still, we've got a lot happening in our own backyards, both literally and figuratively, where we can gear for impact, and there's a lot of opportunity for outreach and galvanizing people around nature-positive places. My agency, UN Habitat, it's the UN Agency for Cities, headquartered in Nairobi, did a study a few years ago. We looked at 50 urban parks around the world to try and see what nature was delivering in these spaces, what cities were planning for, what they hadn't planned for, and what was hidden, what they didn't even notice nature was providing. And so what we see here, and I'll start with this, which is slightly positive in contrast to my opening. At the far upper left, we see 4 ecosystem services that were completely hidden that nature in most of these 50 cities was delivering. Nobody knew about them, completely for free. Pollination, carbon storage, nutrient recycling, accumulating organic matter. And what fascinated us is that these four are all very critical for solving some of the biggest challenges around the world today, including the climate crisis and food insecurity. And if cities knew more about what nature was delivering, there would be more incentive for them to invest in more and bigger and better green projects and green spaces. That was really important as a figure for two studies that followed, one by the Convention on Biological Diversity and partners, including Habitat. It was the first global projection of urban expansion and its impact on nature. And this is some years old now, but it said that cities were due to more than double in size by 2030. Building more city between, I think this was 2012 and 2030 than in all of history. The other study done here at Weitzman showed that, if I get this correctly, more than 90% of cities over, I think, 200,000 in biodiversity hotspots are expanding in direct conflict with valuable natural habitat. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence on the ground that my agency sees is that there are really two types, predominantly two types of urban growth. On the left, you see unplanned urbanism, and on the right, you see badly planned in terms of segregated and sprawling. Global meta-studies, like the one on the left, show that indeed cities across the world are rapidly declining in density, particularly at the peri-urban edge, with the effect, as you see on the right, of massive landscape fragmentation. Not many places are looking at this. This is Baden-Württemberg in southwest Germany, actually a big pioneer. But even there, landscapes being cut into smaller and smaller pieces of declining function for nature and ultimately for people. Slightly out of order here. Back to the Weitzman School and Landscape Architecture program, they did what was for us a really inspiring study of cities in biodiversity hotspots. First, looking at projected urban expansion and its impact on ecologically sensitive areas, looking at a more coarse scale at the time at what that would mean at individual peri-urban edges, because of course global impact is the sum of the million decisions made every day within actual cities. I think one thing this underscored for us too is this notion that cities and nature are not binary or static. There's a lot of messy overlap and they're constantly changing. That frontier is expanding every day. And we realized then with Penn that we needed desperately to be able to get to grips with this growth in a way that would allow us to proactively plan for the immediate future. And I'm all out of order here. One way we started doing that was with planned city extensions, particularly in the kind of secondary cities in which we work that tend to be fast-growing, low capacity, facing massive infrastructural backlogs. This was in Kigali, but we didn't really understand at the time very much about the impact on nature at the edge. So we got together with Penn to do a multidisciplinary risk mapping methodology that looks, you see at far left, projecting urban change over time, projecting climate risk to 2050, projecting the risk to biodiversity to 2050. In the middle column, you see all of that overlay, which is producing, in essence, a prediction of where land use conflict will happen. And then at the far right, you see then a kind of prioritization of where a city should intervene to be able to avoid the most harm to nature. This is the kind of schema. It's looking at a spectrum of possibilities from the core to the extreme periphery in a city. This was in Honiara. Where can the city, at the one hand, preserve at the far edge in areas of high value and high risk? Where can it employ nature-based solutions in places where human populations are threatened by climate, and so forth? This is an early piece that we're actually doing with Oliver. This is San Jose. It's our next test case. And the point here really is, again, to look at that full spectrum of options. This takes it one step further. I'm running out of time, but the idea is to translate this in a very perceptible way in cities that are very low on data, so that they can make educated decisions right now about where and how to develop with minimal impact on nature, so that ultimately we end up not with the left, which is sprawling and segregated, but something more like on the right, which is exploring infill and densification options inside, allowing for things like peri-urban agriculture on the outside, because we know most of these cities won't have a second chance to get things right, so they've got to do it right now. Thanks.
All right, hi everyone. So my name is Erica Smith-Fichman, and I am the acting manager of our urban forestry unit at Philadelphia Parks and Recreation. I'm going to talk a little bit about our urban forest and the recently released Philly Tree Plan. Actually, it was a year ago at this point, but released last year, Philly Tree Plan for how we are going to grow the urban forest equitably. So it's a little tough to see it. The screen is much brighter than I think I expected, but Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, we are a city agency, and we actually manage over 10,000 acres of parkland here in the city of Philadelphia, and over half of that is natural ecosystems like forests, meadows, wetlands, riparian. We also manage 117,000 street trees in the right-of-way along the streets. So just for context, we are managing the majority of the urban forest here in Philadelphia. We also do storm cleanup. This is kind of a hidden part of what we do at Parks and Rec. Whether the trees are falling from the parkland or they're falling from private property, blocking streets, it's a very specialized skill, and so our crews clean up after storms. We also have a community forestry program called Tree Philly, where we work closely with community to plant trees in the ways that they prioritize. So these are some folks from one of the PHA public housing locations in Point Breeze, and they have planted dozens of trees in the front yards of their properties in partnership with my program. So the urban forest, when we talk about it, it's not just the street trees in the parkland. Trees don't recognize boundaries, political boundaries or legal boundaries. So we're talking about the entirety of the urban forest: street trees, yard trees, industrial land, alleyways. And so when we started to create the Philly Tree Plan, we were thinking about all of these locations. And why do we care about trees? The urban forest is the lungs of the city, creating the oxygen we breathe. I'm gonna swing through these. Protection from heat. Some neighborhoods in our city are up to 22 degrees hotter than surrounding areas. This is research from the Office of Sustainability and the Public Health Department. And something people don't think about quite as much is the role of the urban forest on mental health and physical health. There's research that shows that trees, if you can see a view of trees and greenery from your hospital room, you will actually recover more quickly. And another reason why we care about this is that the urban forest is an environmental justice issue. So this is light, but it actually still proves the point quite well that some areas of the city have a lot more trees than others, and they correlate, unfortunately, inversely with a lot of things that make our city livable and that are part of the environmental justice of our city. So you can see that where there are fewer trees, there is more poverty, and there are more Black and brown residents. So the greater the urban canopy, the whiter and richer the folks. And so this is common throughout the cities in America. So what does our urban forest look like right now? It encompasses about 20% of the city. And so this is, if you're mapping urban canopy, you are looking at how much of the ground is covered by leaves and branches. So about 20% of the ground is covered by leaves and branches. Again, you can see not distributed equitably across the city. And we've actually lost 6% of our tree canopy between 2008 and 2018 when we did these studies. That's about 1,000 football fields worth of tree canopy, if you need that visual. So these are the reasons why we started the process of creating a strategic plan. We wanted environmental justice, community engagement, and sustainability to be the tenets that we used throughout the process. It was released in February of 2023. And one of the first things we did when we were creating it is we mapped the priority areas of the city based on a lot of those variables I was talking about. So this is poverty, health indicators like asthma rates, mental health indicators, and heat, and a couple of other variables to identify which areas of the city are going to benefit the most from increased investment. You can see in the map all the way on the right, the darker orange areas are the higher priority for increased investment. And these are the neighborhoods that are going to benefit the most from more trees. And so we used that priority map when we were doing our community engagement to make sure that people in those neighborhoods had a voice in the plan priorities. So we did we had like 6 or 7 different tools that we used to create the plan. And we were really pleased that 60% of the responses we received to all those various tools were in high and medium priority zip codes across the city. So we did a survey that we translated into 8 different languages, and we received over 7,000 responses across the city for that. We also did a very intense ambassador program in those priority areas where we paid a stipend to 22 people to be ambassadors to the plan from their neighborhoods. So we were not having them go proselytize about how great trees were to their neighbors. We wanted them to tell us what were the challenges they were encountering and the challenges that their friends and neighbors were encountering. So they did 62 peer interviews that we incorporated. And then we attended existing meetings that were happening in these neighborhoods and spoke to about 850 people that way as well. Key takeaways, I'm kind of gonna push through this because I don't know how much time I have left. But one of the things I wanna really note is that people in the city understand that trees have value, and they don't need us to tell them that. What they need is for the city and partners to maintain the trees we have, to build trust so that they will be more confident and comfortable in having trees planted around their property, because trees have costs, and some of them are surprise costs. And we have a city that is over a quarter living under the poverty line, and people cannot afford to have those surprise costs, like having to redo their pipes occasionally. This does happen, and it becomes kind of a scary tale that people tell each other. And people will not want trees for these reasons. They don't want the roots to get into their pipes or to bust their sidewalk up or things like that. These are the burdens that people perceive for trees, and they're real too. And so one of our big goals is to reduce the burden of trees on residents. And so there are a lot of ways we can do that by communicating better, investing in people so that they can be paid to plant and care for trees in their own neighborhoods, advocating for them, celebrating the successes and the ways that people have appreciate trees in their neighborhoods, protecting our existing urban forest, making sure that when we grow the urban forest, we are doing it equitably across the city, because a lot of our systems just exacerbate the inequality, because we're a very, very reactive system. So people who have the ability to request tree work or tree planting, they do that, and those people tend to be richer and whiter. So we have to grow the urban forest equitably across the city and coordinate better. So just a few things about how we've made progress on implementation. We updated the zoning code so that when people are developing, they are required to plant more trees than previously. We also are assessing fees if people remove trees from a site. and do not replace them. So this is a new funding source for the urban forestry work we do. We have increased our customer service staff at the urban forestry unit. And this seems like a small thing, but it's very, very important. Communication and being able to call someone and speak to a person is extremely important when you are concerned about something like a tree that has real implications on public safety. We are doing a comprehensive assessment of those natural lands because, just because it's green doesn't mean it's good. And we need to know what the quality of the ecosystem is in those natural areas. We have some new programs that we are partnering on. For example, we're working with the Commerce Department to plant trees on commercial corridors, but also to pay people to care for them, which is a really big, exciting step. And we've done some great fundraising. We've been able to have some city budget increases, some foundation support, and then we recently were awarded a Forest Service grant for $12 million that will be split amongst a lot of the stakeholders who do work in the urban forest. It also includes over $1 million to re-grant out to community-based organizations who are doing this work. All right. And that's my contact info if you have more questions.
Here, real quick, bear with us.
Yeah, it's just to advance the slide.
Okay, perfect. So, hello, I'm Gena Wirth from SCAPE Landscape Architecture. I'm going to start my stopwatch so we don't go over. We're a landscape architecture firm based in New York City, and we work on many urban ecological projects, and we work directly with a very wide range of clients, some cities, some private real estate developers, and everything in between to think about urban ecology in our landscape. Right now, I'm very interested in designing with invertebrates, so this is like a very specific, but I think very important and maybe bizarre topic to talk about today. But why invertebrates? I thought it was great how Andrew kicked off talking about the sixth extinction. Invertebrates are essential to all life, including human life, but not exclusively human life. This is a little snippet from the E.O. Wilson speech talking about what would happen if invertebrates were to disappear from planet Earth, doubting that the human species could last more than a couple of months and the world would return to the state of 1 billion years ago, composed primarily of bacteria, algae, and a few other very simple multicellular plants. So maybe not ideal. Invertebrates really support this kind of lower trophic level, supporting greater biodiversity around them. From a design perspective, they respond very quickly and have many different reproductive cycles within short time frames. So they're a great species to design around because they reproduce and grow quickly. They're indicators of landscape health, and they are in quiet decline. So the sixth extinction is magnified in the invertebrate world. There's a great New York Times article from a couple years ago that was very controversial, maybe less controversial now, called The Insect Apocalypse. Recommend you look at it. But this is just kind of information that's been really informing our design work and our practice across a very wide variety of scales. So SCAPE is known for some of our aquatic and underwater work featuring oysters, and we're beginning to do more work thinking very carefully about pollinators and more terrestrial invertebrates, like different insect species. And I'll just cover quite a range of different ideas and concepts that we've been kind of testing in and out of the studio in the professional and academic context. One of the projects we have under construction right now, this is a drone view or aerial view on the right here. This is the coastline of Staten Island. This is a large-scale coastal infrastructure project working with engineers to think about how to protect the vulnerable edges of Staten Island from storm surges like Hurricane Sandy. But it's also about how can we do that at the same time as regenerating underwater ecosystems, and in particular invertebrate life like oyster reefs, which once used to occur in this area. So it's just like a rendering of that. You can see these kind of unique habitat features that we call reef streets extending. You You can't see them in this image because they're underwater. They're invisible, out of sight. It's the topic of today's panel. But this is this project at a lower tide, kind of showing some of these habitat interventions that are going to be seeded with oysters and create almost like artificial oyster reef environments supporting these different species. And at the same time, while they're supporting these invertebrate species, they're also supporting like larger vertebrate life, like this harbor seal that's hauling out on one of the breakwaters under construction. And so it's very important, as we build cities and as we build housing stock or infrastructure, how do we think about coastal infrastructure that can support non-human life as well as human life? Kind of switching like ecosystems, I've been thinking a little bit about insect and landscape relationships and taught a studio on it a couple of years ago at the Harvard GSD. We don't think a lot about insects beyond many of like the more charismatic insects like monarch butterflies, which probably many of you in the room know about. But the studio was this unique opportunity to kind of investigate or think through the different designed relationships and impacts that our urban systems and our insect systems have. So began to look more carefully at like some of these more territorial patterns of how insects use different environments at a very like larger than regional scale here, with monarchs migrating in this kind of interesting multi-generational migratory pathway up and down the country every year. The impacts that different insect species are beginning to have on our forests and our regions, right? This is the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive insect impacting hemlock trees and basically killing hemlock trees throughout large swaths of our forests. Urban and rural relationships. This is a study in Germany, how native bees are actually performing and surviving better in cities than in their rural counterparts because cities are providing the biodiversity they need, where rural areas are highly agricultural and quite toxic because of the ways that we treat agricultural areas. Some of these like celestial relationships, like dung beetles create these little balls of dung, very important for decomposition, kind of gross, but very cute because they navigate how they move the little dung piles around using the stars. So there's all these like hidden relationships that we're not really aware of. New infrastructural relationships emerging. This is a study of mayfly populations laying their eggs on a highway because it reflects light in the same way a water body reflects light, which is where they're supposed to lay their eggs, not highways. So we're kind of dramatically intervening in some of these ecological systems in ways that we really don't have any idea about. And then like these vegetal relationships. So this is kind of, I think people are familiar with like the relationship between monarch butterflies and they need milkweed to reproduce and survive. That's not just a relationship confined to monarchs, that's a relationship confined to thousands and thousands of species that require a single species of plant for its survival, or a single family of plants. So if you don't have that plant, you don't have that insect in your life or in your world. Insects are also just like very micro and small, so you can kind of create these interesting small design spaces, even in urban footprints where you don't have a lot of room. So I'll kind of speed up and get to the point here, but I think the major point is what Andrea was talking about around urbanization, agricultural intensification, and climate change creating all these problems, but also the way and the kind of totalitarian aesthetics we have about landscape, creating environments that are completely inhospitable to native insect life. So in the studio I was teaching, some of the students began to develop projects and kind of concepts around these different ideas, thinking about how to support fireflies in a semi-high density suburban environment, or how to redesign highway corridors along migratory pathways of monarch butterflies to encourage and support monarch migration over its multi-generational cycle. And then also at SCAPE on some of our more like pretty straightforward, like classic landscape architecture works. We're working on a lot of very small scale waterfront parks for real estate developers. We're beginning to do research on how we can select species for specific pollinators. We've been working with Sarah Kornbooth, who's a entomologist, like actually going out in the field in these highly industrial sites and collecting insect species, and beginning to develop site-specific species lists to support specific categories of insects that are within decline in these areas. So this is an example of some of the insects she collected along the Gowanus Canal, which is a Superfund site. And we're trying to match these species with different plant species to support their life. So one example, this little cutie here is the eastern willow miner bee, which requires willows to survive. And typically in our planting plans, willows haven't been a preferred species because they can be kind of like weedy, aesthetic, and a little messy, and not always what like the classic real estate developer wants. But we're working very hard in some of our projects to think about environments and places that can support these trees and also support those specific species. So I'll end there and hope to talk more about it in our Q&A.
Let's go in order.
Yeah.
In order.
You can match us.
At different scales.
Fantastic. Thank you all for your presentations. This was really exciting, and I think we're working at scales both large and small. So I'm really grateful. I'm Catherine Steven. I'm the chair of the Landscape Architecture Department here at University of Pennsylvania, and delighted to have all of you with us today to talk about this really important topic about cities and nature, and really kind of unpacking that very unuseful binary, right? So I think let's blur that a little bit with this, and thank you so much to Oliver for putting this together. It's really been a wonderful experience working with you. So I wanted to kick off again just a little bit with this, the topic of the visible and the invisible. But first, maybe to touch on the sixth extinction, and ever the optimist, I just want to reflect a little bit on what we heard through all of the presentations, sort of as an undercurrent, which is that in fact humans can increase biodiversity. I think it's a really powerful concept that we should keep in mind. I've been reading quite a bit of Pablo Tavares' work on the Amazon forest, and he's exploring the food forests that were constructed and improvements of soil done by indigenous peoples who lived in the forest and actually increased the biodiversity of the Amazon forest, which we think of as a very diverse place. But it could actually be increased through human care and stewardship. So I think it's really important to think about the impact of humans does not always need to be seen as negative. And I think in each of your presentations, we see in fact this entanglement of humans with other species actually being a positive encounter. So Gena, really thinking about how do we design with and for insects. You said with insects, right? So I think it's very specific. You're thinking about that as a collaborative process. And of course, we see in both of the projects, how do we design with street trees, Erica? And so I think this idea that we actually need to work with people to increase canopy and think about that improvement. And of course, Andrew, really thinking about what is that line between the urban and non-urban, or the peri-urban as you describe, and how can we start to think about pathways through? And again, this importance of UN habitat and thinking about how do we work with people to make reduce the fragmentation that's happening in urban development. So it was really wonderful to hear those themes kind of moving through all of that. So I think this idea of like, how do we think about extinction in new ways, which is more about positive increase rather than reduction. So with that, I wanted to just open up a few topics of conversation, and you alluded, Gena, to the theme, the invisible versus the invisible versus the visible in the work that we do. So I was reflecting a little bit, Andrew, you're looking at hidden or invisible ecosystem services. Again, I think we could talk about that term, but some of the things that are so critical, carbon capture and pollination, these things that are happening invisible and sort of invisible because they're not being valued, right? So I think that's one way we might address the Uber theme here. And Erica, I think in the case of the Philly tree canopy, it's actually visible. I think you see disinvestment, you see environmental injustices, you see systemic racism in the footprint of the city as we move through it. So I think it's kind of, it's actually a very visible thing, and how do we make people aware of what's staring them in the face? And so I think that's a kind of invisible topic you might address. And Gena, really just thinking about the kind of the scalar idea of invisibility or the visual. I love how you said we do a lot of work under the water. We're thinking about an underwater hidden landscape. We're thinking about a scale of engagement that is not always visible to the human eye necessarily unless you stop and look and take note. So I think those are sort of beautiful things. So maybe for each of you, how could you maybe share some examples or perhaps a little deeper reflection on some of those ideas about the processes that are also, invisible perhaps, or visible, that are shaping your own research and work, and in what ways might we make those processes more visible? Let's start with Andrew.
Thanks so much. I mentioned a bit about certain ecosystem services that our own work as humans, proactive work in cities for nature, are promoting that we haven't seen. Some of that is hidden because it's invisible to the human eye. Some of it's visible, but we don't notice because it may not be cute or charismatic, important as those things are. A lot of what was on the screen with your presentation, but they might be mundane and everyday. There's nothing particularly sexy about nutrient recycling, except perhaps for a dung beetle. So we do need to find other ways to value that. But I think one extra element I'd like to bring in is the invisibility of risk. Risk is something that is invisible until it's reality. And then it's a problem. And then it's either very expensive to fix or it's too late in a lot of places that simply can't, for a lot of reasons I won't go into. But ecosystem restoration is something we can do in places where we've degraded a landscape. It's super important, shouldn't stop. But it can't keep pace with the destruction of habitat that's accelerating. So I'll leave it at that, but to say that through a lot of the projection and risk mapping that we're working on right now, that is something we're trying to make visible. I hope we manage.
I think that the first thing that what is visible or invisible about your work makes me think is kind of meeting that with a question, which is, to whom is it visible or invisible? Because, one of the biggest things that we have discovered and kind of always known with urban forestry and urban greening in general is that, you can't do it all as one city agency. You have the majority of the land actually owned by private residents, and even like residential land is the majority of the land use in the city. And so, like I said, green is not good. It's not an equal, it's not just green is good, right? Some trees, if they're not maintained, they're bad ambassadors for greening. And you have to think about what are the things that are invisible that will influence people's behavior so that they will plant these things. They will consider the ecosystem benefits and not just the pretty flowers. They will be comfortable having a tree on their property or in front of their property, even if it doesn't belong to them, because it could impact their property. And so maintaining the choice of what to plant is very important and the source of a lot of study. But maintaining those plantings that is the trust building work that needs to be done so that people will be comfortable having greenery around them, because it is unpredictable to people. That is invisible. They don't know exactly what's going to happen. They just know that this happened to my aunt and this happened to this person, and they, couldn't afford to get it fixed, right? So you need to maintain, you need to have support systems to make those, and you need to figure out what are those challenges, what are the invisible challenges that will impact the behavior change so that we can bring people into this, to a place where they are willing and comfortable to have trees and greenery around their properties.
Great. Well, Andrew, I also hope that we figure it out in time and make some quick collective action around preserving and expanding our ecosystems. I'm maybe a little less optimistic than Catherine, but still do the work, right? I think, when I think about the invisible, it's just it's almost like a loaded word for our practice at SCAPE, because I think we do focus on, or like a big piece of our portfolio of work is really about looking into these ecosystems, where we really have to start a project with a lot of research about things we just don't know, right? Like when we started our Living Breakwaters project that really thought about trying to cultivate like a large scale urban oyster reef, like a mile long urban oyster reef, we had to really like learn, how does an oyster reproduce in a natural environment? How do oyster reefs grow? And then how is that impacted by the kind of hidden underwater ecosystem of the city, which is like very different than a robust, clean water ecosystem of a non-urban environment. And so we end up in the office doing like a lot of like mapping and life cycle drawings to kind of think about these invisible processes, right? So to use like the oyster as an example, an oyster in New York City, right, which used to be the oyster capital of the world, and oysters were like as oyster carts like around the street. It was like a human food source. They were as dense as like hot dog carts today are around New York, right? It was like this very common food. We don't think about eating oysters from New York waters anymore for like very good reasons, but maybe one day in the future we might. But they have to like release a spat, which is like a free floating larva that just kind of gets pushed around by the waves and the water column for a couple weeks. And it gets it's like a fertilized egg essentially. And then it might land on something underwater, and it might land on a pier edge, or it might land on like a kind of sedimenty, undifferentiated mud bottom, which is what a lot of New York Harbor is. And then either that little spat survives or it doesn't. Most don't, because they are suffocated by sediment, and there's not like the structure that an oyster spat needs to turn into an oyster shell, which by nature is also a great place for another oyster spat to land on and grow another shell, which is how you actually develop oyster reefs. But all of these things are happening underwater. They're like completely invisible. In the case with insects, they might be happening below the ground or in the tree canopy where you can't see them, or they're just so microscopic and small that, also maybe we don't have 5 hours to sit around and like watch a hole in the ground and wait for the native bee to crawl out of it, right? So you really have to like talk to people and spend time like mapping out the different processes and really understanding how our species, how do they want to use our urban environment, and how is the urban environment like preventing them from thriving or succeeding? And so much of that is invisible, and there's so little data on that, especially for insects. There's new insect species being discovered every day, and so so little is known about these kind of very important creatures.
These are great responses. Thank you all so much. I think it's really it's fascinating to think about these unknowns and unseen things, and how we can think differently, and the impacts of those actions and that kind of thinking. To address again, I wanted to kind of take us to the future of cities, which is again another important topic leading the day today here. So I think a lot about this idea of technology, and part of the sort of the subtitle of the conference was Technology's Billions of Years in the Making for our panel. This is something that Oliver was working on. So in popular culture, and I guess the idea about technology is really interesting to me. If you break it back, like take it back down to its root, it's techne. It comes from a Greek word, which has so much embodiment of craft and invention and technique, right? So I think let's think about it in that lens. So often in popular culture, we hear the future of cities, bringing to mind this technological idea of visions of flying cars and smart technological objects. But what did those ideas of technology miss about the importance of the, let's put it in quotes, the technologies of nature that have been under development for billions of years in the making? So what are some inventions of nature that may have been perfected through nature in ways that might be overlooked in a techno-utopian future? Pop quiz.
Well, I have a little insect story, which is, I mean, I would maybe answer like, I think in the techno-utopian future, like a lot of nature is just overlooked, you know, so just in general. But, you know, one of these examples of like technology billions of years in the making that is like been completely invisible to me my entire life until like 2 years ago was I grew up in Delaware, not far from here, like in this kind of, you know, eastern deciduous woodland environment. I was very lucky my parents like built a house like in the woods. We grew up in the woods, and there were always these black swallowtail butterflies around. And I was like, oh, these are really beautiful. You know, they would like fly up into the skylights and like die, and I would find them on the porch, but they were just like very present throughout my entire life, and I've always thought very like fondly about them. But I never thought about like what they ate or what they needed. And then when I was starting to kind of like learn more about native plant species and plant insect relationships, which are like literally is technology billions of years in the making. Plant insect mutualism is technology and dependency. You know, I was like, oh, I wonder what the host plant is for the black swallowtail. And I just looked up and I was like, oh, it's sassafras, spice bush, and tulip tree, which are the two trees that are predominant like woodland trees in my house, like in the area I grew up like playing around. And it was just like, it's like maybe a small thing, but it was such a light bulb moment that like I had those butterflies because of that ecosystem, and I don't see those butterflies today because those two trees are not near my house in New York City. Like it was just such like a mind-opening thing to realize I had been experiencing this whole environment that was all crafted based upon this like plant-insect relationship that was like completely invisible.
Not to hijack the question, but since you've opened up the original Greek definition, I'm thinking about the making and remaking that's part of technology, and it occurred to me that there are a lot of underappreciated cultural and spiritual values of nature, and it's particularly in landscape. Memory, identity, a lot of things have been viewed from which we've become quite detached in modern life, and that's something vital, I think, for us to try and reconnect to. One small tool that we have, which uses technology in the traditional sense, the Kobo toolbox, we tend to deploy students in different cities with their mobile phones to actually take an inventory of the spatial assets of the city, because oftentimes in cities with very little data and small capacity that are fast growing, they don't know what their public spaces are. They don't know which green spaces they have a right to be in, and so they geolocate these with traditional modern technology, and through a questionnaire that looks at ownership, occupancy, use, and perceptions, begin to, I think, really hone in on the values that the people in these spaces might not have occurred to them to think about had they not been prompted. And so begin the kind of mapping in these cities of cultural touchstones, how their identity and memories is kind of embedded in these places. So it's a little ethereal, that answer, but I think it's an important one.
This question makes me think of how much we don't know about plants and greenery and the natural world as technology, and it makes me think of an aha moment that I had. I got to visit the Biodome in Arizona, which is an actual place where they tried to put a bunch of people into a completely enclosed place for a number of years, and they tried to see how long they could live there. They had a goal: how long can they live there? They thought of everything. And they ran out of oxygen in like less than a year because they didn't know enough about soil metabolism and the organisms in the soil and how many interactions are happening there. And that was just totally blew my mind. So yeah, I mean, we know a lot about greenery, and you know, my perspective is trees. Trees are green infrastructure. They are powerhouses of biological processes. But there's still so much we don't know.
Those are great answers. You did very well. I'm always thinking like, what do we need to invent next? And I almost feel like we have to invent the way we think. But I'll bring this back a little bit, Andrew, to what you were just alluding to now, this question about value. And again, I think in this context, we need to think about how we place value on things and mutualisms and spaces. And so here's the prompt. Much of the conversation, and this comes back to what we were speaking about a little bit earlier, about the benefits of biodiversity in cities centers around the idea of ecosystem services. The quantification, often monetary, of the services provided by nature, such as carbon sequestration, biodiversity enhancement, but also things like delight, for example. Do you find the concept of ecosystem services useful in your work? Or what would you identify perhaps as the benefits of natural systems in urban environments that are difficult or even impossible to quantify?
I love this question because in my work, it's not particularly valuable to talk about carbon sequestration because a lot of the communities that we're working with do not care about that. Or they do care about that, but there are so many other concerns that take precedence. And so, one of the 8 goals of the Philly Tree Plan is celebrating the intersection between trees and people and the cultural representation, the symbolism. And we actually developed a marketing campaign called the City of Arborly Love to really connect to, and if you want to get really nerdy, we like to call it the City of Arborly Love and Shrubberly Affection, just like to ourselves because we're big nerds. But it's all about the connection, the emotional connection that people have with trees and really pulling on that. Because the field of urban forestry has gone through lots of phases of trying to explain, in the best ways possible and the value of the urban forest, using the words that we think people will care about. There's been whole marketing campaigns where you put a price tag on each tree and like, how much is this worth? Carbon sequestration is, another big topic, but we have found that really appealing to the emotional connection is one of the really most impactful ways. And then of course, maintaining trees and everything that I've been saying, like showing care, right? Care for the urban forest, care for the people who are impacted by the urban forest and could benefit if it was properly taken care of, and the ways that people care about trees in their lives and what symbols they represent.
I find the ecosystem services both like extremely useful sometimes, but also extremely challenging other times. I think exactly for the reason, Erica, that you mentioned earlier, just like there are so many things we just do not know. And if you don't know it, how can you quantify it and how can you use it in your calculation, right? And sometimes the benefits of natural systems, especially in the kind of quantification world, often end up with this like terrible term called ancillary benefits, right? Like you might be able to quantify like how much water a tree can pull and transpire out of the atmosphere, right? But then it has all these other ancillary benefits like mental health and many other unquantifiable things, right? Like just side things, which actually are like quite important, So you think about like how we might apply the ecosystem services quantification model with the data we have today to a species like a firefly, and you think about, okay, fireflies actually play a really important like predatory role in the food chain, and they're also important food source for other animals, but also like they're magical and joyful. And do you want to grow up in a world where your children don't experience fireflies, and how do you put a number on that? So I think that's just it's like this inherent challenge with this work is they're just our ecosystems are full of unknowns and understudied and not able to be comprehensively quantified with like the current state of the world.
I'll just throw in, as Gena said, totally agree. There are a lot of trade-offs involved. I mean, ecosystem services have been helpful in the sense that they've been able to label benefits to quantify them that might not otherwise have been recognized. But a risk too. I mean, to subject anything to a bottom line in a way also suggests that they can be offset through payments, and the deeper values of how the ecosystem works could be undermined if that's taken to an extreme. I just throw in there, I think something we need to add to the mix in terms of our valuing of ecosystems is greater empathy for other times, other spaces, other species. A lot of what sells well in sort of my world is the idea of nature-based solutions, which is the part of nature that happens to be useful in an anthropomorphic sense to us and to solving our problems. But that's got to extend further. Other species, our own species in other times, and so on.
Well, just to build on that point about empathy with like maybe a happy story. When I started working in New York like 15 years ago around like the kind of underwater like oyster world, we're teaming with a nonprofit group called the Billion Oyster Project. They've done an excellent job at making oysters, like kind of transforming them into a charismatic invertebrate and like helping people kind of connect with the idea of the urban oyster and telling this very empathetic story. So much so that Prince William came to New York less than a year ago, I think, and like waded out and with his like waders into the East River and like looked at underwater oysters. And they're getting like massive amounts of funding to do incredible work, and that's just been a transformation in the last decade. So I do think these empathetic stories and the Arbor slogans, they really do kind of bring people and they open their eyes to these invisible processes, and I do think have the potential to make real change.
Great, thank you all so much. It makes me think a little bit. I love really rethinking what our language is, and to say something like ecosystem services, we really have to unpack what we mean by that. And I completely empathize with the nature-based solutions. I'm looking at a white paper with the U.S. Army Corps, and boy, you need a whole glossary to work with them. But they do sort of say really funny things, and they use cost-benefit analysis, so they need to put numbers on services, let's say, but they always kind of have a little workaround, because CBA is always going to privilege the rich and the kind of Erica, you touched on this so much in the Philly tree plant. It's always the places that already have the wealth and the canopy that are going to get more. So that's a sort of flawed religion. Boy, but they do have something. Don't get me started on cost-benefit analysis. But they have something called other social effects, which they put everything else. It's all the things that we're talking about here, which are the things that we actually really do value and maybe can't quantify. So the way that we're kind of thinking about possibilities of other social effects kind of rising up and taking precedence. Thank you all for the responses to these questions. We have some time, and I'm sure these folks can think on their feet. So we would love to take some questions from the audience if any of you have anything, and I think we have a mic runner also here for anyone. I see a question right over here. Yeah. There's one there. We'll stack you up.
Hi, I had a question about designing for invertebrates and the role of the public sector. Since you spoke about a bunch of projects in New York City, I was wondering what New York City government is currently doing to try to influence private projects to design more with native insects in mind, and if there's something that you wish they were doing that they aren't. I wonder if you have any, I know policy is not necessarily your space, but I was wondering if you had ideas for what the city could do to push private projects to sort of incorporate this more.
Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, I'm not working with New York City on any invertebrate projects right now. Our Living Breakwater project is a project of the state, and I think they're interested in the oyster aspects of it because of its actual immense social engagement and educational potential. So I would say I see that as a real bridge, like this kind of empathy building device that it kind of encourages cities or public policy makers to see another, what did you call it, Catherine? Not ancillary benefit, but other social benefit, right? Of these kind of techniques is that you can bring classrooms and school groups and kind of build capacity and build knowledge in a way that's very, I think, popular and supported. To kind of skip to the second half of your question around cities can do so many things and policy can do so many things. I think just on a basic level, I mean, Erica, you probably have thoughts about this around species lists and planting plans. There's so many reasons why you would choose or not choose a different species. But one thing that New York City recently did in the Gowanus, where I was showing these kind of real estate development projects is they loosened their zoning code for waterfront public open space to allow tidally inundated planting area to count towards a planting requirement, which meant that the city acknowledged a kind of existing type of landscape that's previously categorized as like not meeting the city requirement. Therefore, no developer has incentive to build it whatsoever because it would just be like a bonus to having it count as like planting area, which is like a required thing that developers have to do on these sites. And because that was allowed, we're able to plant a whole host of other species that also happen to support invertebrate insect life that wouldn't be able to be supported because it wasn't previously in the legislation. So I think thinking in a more nuanced way about our landscapes beyond like, oh, is it green? Is it planted? Does it look like Central Park? Therefore, like it's good. And does it look like, the edges of a messy shoreline? Oh, that's bad. Oh, we don't need that. I think we need to be much more expansive and embrace the many kinds of landscapes that exist in our world.
Hello, this is Rachita and I'm a Master's of Landscape student completing my graduating this year. So my question is for all three of you belonging to a professional practice, a government institute and a global organization. When we talk about landscape, we are aware as landscape architects, but then there are other people who do not think about landscape that passionately, who do not think about insects that passionately. So my question is, how do we bring funding for these projects and how do we make people more aware? Because I think the people who suffer the most, the people living in slums, like I belong to India, so I have seen that, and they are the best stewards of nature. They live a simple life, they walk, they do not waste resources as in the big cities. So I'm just curious to know how being in this profession we can educate people about leading a more simple life and solving some of these issues.
Big broad question.
Well, I definitely heard two questions, and the funding part is the one that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think increasing transparency and communication between the agencies and institutions that do a lot of the care of our urban forest and the planting of our urban forest is a really big key to advocating for increased funding. I could talk for a really long time about this, but in my mind, making sure that people who care about this know what the challenges are and are respected and given the information they need to advocate for it is a really crucial part of raising more money and making it a priority for folks who fund.
Maybe it's okay. I'll take the sort of unofficial second half of that question. I think something we found at UN Habitat is that slums and sprawl are really two sides of the same coin. In a lot of cases, slums are a symptom of a housing market not delivering for a large segment of the population. A lot of really hard-pressed, undercapacitated, fast-growing cities, absent a lot of things. Data, political will, find it very tempting to give multinational developers large super blocks at the periphery of town, which a developer will make into what's most profitable in the short term, which is often a segregated, single-use, gated compound, which is inherently unaffordable to a large majority. So as a symptom, you get informal inside, and you're absolutely right. Most dwellers in informal settlements have very low per capita footprints, however way you look at it. So one thing we're doing as an agency is to try to kind of crack that nut between the mayor, the developer, and residents, and to suggest there is a demand for other things if cities are willing to push developers to provide more alternative and more affordable rates. So it's a tough one, but it's a start.
I think that the way we think about it in our projects, right, is like it's such a powerful tool to be designing with natural processes because of all of these like rippling impacts that we don't even totally fully understand. And so when you work on a project like Living Breakwaters, which is a coastal infrastructure project, and has more engineers than any project I've ever worked on, but it has these ecological aspects to it. You know, it's not funded through ecological funding sources, it's funded through Hurricane Sandy recovery money. And it did its own cost benefit study, or we did a cost benefit study of like, you know, the financial assets along the shoreline, which include open space and private residences and public roadways and public infrastructure that it protects or helps reduce risk to. But it also has all these other stories that we've pulled out that really speak to very different populations within and around the study area. So the kind of underwater habitat aspects of it, like obviously have ecological benefit for the handful of people in the room that care about that, like that's a positive. The DEC is ultimately taking ownership of that project, the Department of Environmental Conservation, so it has value to our maintenance partner. The project has value to recreational fishermen in Staten Island. Staten Island has a really big fishing culture, and having the kind of like sub-aquatic structural complexity that the breakwaters and the oyster reefs provide is just like hotspot for fish, right? So that's like, you know, that's not what we started the project, but it has this value. And it also has recreational benefit in terms of creating kind of shallower, calmer water behind the breakwaters that opens up more potential for like water access and kayaking and other kinds of like outdoor education. So any project you work on with a natural system, I think you have to look for the story and you have to find the audience to support it, but there's so much potential for that within the work.
Great answers. And I want to we're going to wrap up, and I know our guests will be here to speak with you individually afterward, but I wanted to just say, I love that question, like how do we make this, so it's not just a small circle of folks who are invested in these things, but how do we make it a more rich and nuanced conversation that with a platform that reaches many more. So I wanted to just say thank you to Wharton, Weitzman, Future of Cities. What a collaboration. So I think by putting the kind of design mind and the kind of real policy thinking together in the same room is one way to actually achieve that goal. This is where we can really nurture those ideas and those other social effects, which I know are going to be so important as we move our cities into the future. So thank you so much to Andrew, to Gena, to Erica. Why did I had a little brain drain for a second there. You were amazing. I really loved seeing all of the presentations and how they spoke to each other. And thank you so much for being with us today, and especially to Oliver for bringing us all together and the hosts here.